I want to talk about inquiry-based learning and the issue of evaluation when dealing with PDP. These issues have come up in the NAN project on PDP, but also in the Universities of Pawson's Masters in Learning with Technology. The Masters in Learning Technology uses an approach called IDIBLE, which stands for Interdisciplinary Inquiry-Based Learning. And it's been developed at the university by Stephen Powell and Richard Millward and myself as a variation on the Ultraversity project at Anglo-Ruskin University. Our approach has been to create a framework for inquiry-based learning for the whole university, which covers all the different levels of university qualification from foundation to PhD, masters, and for departments in the university to situate their own inquiry-based learning initiatives on that framework. As a pilot of this approach, in my own department we've created a Masters in Learning with Technology, and I want to talk through one of the modules on that course to give you a flavour of how the inquiry-based approach actually works. This is the first module on the Masters, which is called Analysing the Professional Context, and you can see from the description of the purpose of the module that it's geared to getting people to think about the work that they do. Now, the whole purpose of inquiry-based learning is it is based around people's work, so the curriculum is in effect driven by the learner. The key features of this module are analysing the work context, engaging with the online community of fellow students and comparing notes with their experiences, and making plans for what it is that learners actually want to do. In this sense, it's very PDP-like and makes a very interesting example of a module which is effectively geared around PDP, as indeed the whole IDIBLE program is. To actually make this work, though, you need to have some sort of structure to regulate the activities that the learners engage with. And what we've got here are a set of learning outcomes for this particular module, and each module has its own set of learning outcomes. And these learning outcomes are effectively generic in the sense that they try to focus learners on particular aspects of their practice. And each learning outcome has an associated assessment criteria. And so basically we leave it to the learner, for example, to identify how they're going to meet the learning outcome, and also to identify how they're going to evidence their achievement of that learning outcome. So if I just scroll down here for a second, you can actually see the assessment criteria for learning outcome 1. So in this case we would hope learners would be able to show a broader perspective on their own professional practice. Diagramming it or thinking about how it relates to the practice of others are all things that they might do. Learning outcome 2 for this module really revolves around professional discussion about the working practices of the work context. And learners are encouraged here to obviously use the resources that are available to them both within the community of learners that they're working with, but also with the broader professional community that they're engaging with too, and to produce evidence of their discussion and analysis and critical reflection on different professional viewpoints. Learning outcome 3 is really a small-scale action inquiry, and the idea of this is to identify a sort of small-scale project within the workplace that can help the learner to identify the particular learning needs, particular developmental needs that they might have for the future. And that brings us on to learning outcome 4, which is about tying those identified developmental needs to professional opportunities within the workplace, and really doing the sort of professional PDP thing in terms of planning how you're going to manage your personal development in the light of what it is that you feel you need in the professional context. Now, all of these learning outcomes are met with assessment products, which to a large extent are determined by the learner. The learner determines how they are assessed and the sorts of evidence that they produce for assessment. And what the learner needs to do at the end is that they need to stitch all of those different bits of evidence together into a sort of coherent story, which it forms the final assessed product of the module. The way this is managed is through a learning contract which is negotiated between the learner and the learning facilitator. And in the learning contract it's basically a document, a word process document that's usually shared on Google Docs because it provides a good way of sharing documents, where the learner specifies against each week the particular learning outcomes that they're going to concentrate on, the activities that they're going to engage in to meet the learning outcomes that they're trying to meet, and the bits of evidence that they're actually going to produce to show how they've met those learning outcomes. So you can see here's a very simple one actually. This is a student on the course, a current student, whose action inquiry is basically about validating a course in a university. And so you can see that they're identifying the various activities that they're engaged with and identifying the sorts of evidence that they might produce to actually show how they've engaged with those learning outcomes. What's important about this document is it is the touchstone for the learner's engagement with the course. This is effectively the scheme of work, but it's not a scheme of work that's determined by the centre, it's a scheme of work that's really determined by the learner in negotiation with the learning facilitator. So that's the programme. Now what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is to talk about how we evaluate it, how we ask the question, is it any good? What do we mean by it being any good or not good or whatever? And I think this boils down to one question. I think this boils down to an institutional manager in another institution unconnected with our project saying, if I do what you've done on your inquiry-based programme in my institution, what will happen? Now that may not be what people conventionally think of as evaluation, but I want to explain what this really means, because in effect what we're trying to identify is what are the causal mechanisms that are invoked through intervening with a PDP or inquiry-based learning process. In doing this, what we're really doing is following the realistic evaluation approach of Pawson and Tilley. Now, the realistic evaluation approach immediately raises the question, how do you go about identifying mechanisms? Pawson and Tilley say that there are many ways of doing this, but here's one way. This is a technique called SODA, Strategic Options Development and Analysis. It's something that comes from the operational research community. Obviously I have a particular interest in that because it has cybernetic origins, but they've produced some interesting software which allows groups of people to explore different sorts of mechanisms, different descriptions of mechanisms. And you can just see the software at the bottom there. It's called Decision Explorer. And this is something which we're actually using at Bolton on another project, a JISC funded project, on curriculum design. The idea of group exploration of decisions and mechanisms is something which also has been taken up by institutions, and there's a facility at Liverpool John Moores, for example, called the Automatic, where people can sit. You can see there's this huge video wall and people sit on sofas and explore ideas together. Basically it produces a giant mind map on the screen and they can explore that. Then there are other mind mapping tools like FreeMind, for example, which can allow people to situate the different concepts and different ideas that they have about what's going on against what other people think is going on. So how do these techniques cause us to reveal the mechanisms of what's going on in things like PDP? The key thing here, I think, is that in any enterprise like PDP, there are many stakeholders and many perspectives, many observed outcomes which result. Although the causes of those outcomes may be different, and what those outcomes are may be different, Pawson and Tilley assert that they're not that different. And what we need to do is creatively explore theories and ideas as to how different perspectives might be united. So because there are many theoretical perspectives available to us, realistic evaluation is a multi-theory technique. So here, for example, I can start to use FreeMind as a way of exploring the different issues around PDP and inquiry-based learning. So I'm going to just start by saying there's a subheading there about reflective practice. And then, of course, we can drill into that. The bottom line with this, though, is to look at all our stakeholders and to say, what do you think is going on? And so to get people to share their theories, their ideas, as a technique which starts us to accumulate different theories, different perspectives, and get a picture of underlying mechanisms. So what's it all for? Well, for Pawson and Tilley, it's really quite clear. It's about giving people knowledge of real mechanisms that result from doing certain things, in our case PDP. It means it gives managers and teachers and learners greater control of the situations they have to deal with. But it is about expecting bad stuff as well as good stuff. And so it's not about adding value to things, but actually reporting on the real things that actually happen. The bottom line is that knowledge about the real likely outcomes of a situation put practitioners in a stronger position in being able to control them. And I want to leave you with a question, which is to say that we've had lots of research already on PDP. There have been many instances of practice up and down the country. What do we already know about those real mechanisms? What can we already say that is likely to happen if people do it?